Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. Today we shall begin summing up the salient points of learnings that we have seen in this course. So we will have 4 lectures on summing up and discussion. So we began this course by looking at what is economics and what is conservation and how are both of these things related to each other. And we had observed that conservation comes from the Latin word roots con and servare, which means to keep together. So when we say conservation, we are trying to keep together or preserve, protect, and restore the natural environment and the wildlife. On the other hand, economics comes from the Greek word roots, oikos and neme, which means managing the house. So it is a study of how society manages its scarce resources or how decisions are taken to ensure that the scarce resources are used for the maximum benefit of the people. That is, how does the society maximize its surplus or the benefits by using its scarce resources. And we saw that both of these are related because there are certain economic decisions that have ruined the environment. So, things such as pollution or things such as the various industrial disasters that we have observed, things like Minamata disaster or the Bhopal gas tragedy or the Love Canal tragedy. So, there are several economic decisions that have harmed the environment. And in a number of cases, we observe that these are bad economic choices. So we are not saying that economics is bad. Economics is good, but when people do not take into account all the different facets that are necessary for taking the right decisions, then at times people take wrong decisions. And a very important point that we have observed in this case is the externalities. So externalities are the impacts of an action of an agent on the welfare of the bystanders. And when the externalities are not internalized, meaning that when the agent does not take into account the harm that he or she is doing to others, in that case, the economics will be based on incomplete information. And this incomplete information, in a number of cases, will result in bad choices, bad decisions that will even harm the environment. So, some economic decisions, some bad economic decisions have ruined the environment. They have led to collapse of ecosystems and extinction of species. So we have observed things such as oil spills or plastics that are leading to a great amount of damage to our environment. And because we have had such economic decisions, so we are now in a situation that is calling for conservation. So now conservation is no longer a choice. Now conservation is a necessity because we have destroyed our environment to such an extent that now we are facing the negative consequences. So if you look around yourself, you'll find that a number of diseases, especially autoimmune diseases or allergic diseases, they have gone up like crazy in the last few years. And the pollution or the overuse of pesticides are things that have been implicated because of the rapid rise of diseases. These days, we are finding that there is a shortage of water in several locations where earlier there was no shortage. We observed that in the city of Cape Town a few years back, there was such a great crisis of water that they were starting to observe the day zero, a day when there will be no more water left. We are finding a crisis of water in our metro cities, such as Bangalore or cities like Shimla. So earlier we did not have these water shortages, but now there are tremendous amounts of water shortages. So these are all telling us that we have been over exploiting our resources. We are doing agriculture in a manner that is overutilizing water. We have grown our populations to such an extent that now we are over dependent on resources. And when there is an overexploitation of resources, it leads to unsustainable use of resources, which means that in a short period of time, the resources will be gone. Similarly, we look at things like climate change. We have emitted so much amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that now global warming is no longer a theoretical construct. It is something that we are observing right before our eyes. The sea levels are going up, the ice sheets are melting, so many organisms are disappearing, they're getting extinct. So, because of all our actions and the actions of our forefathers, we are now in a situation that is desperately calling for conservation. So, here again, we can correlate that these were the economic decisions of the past that have led to this situation. So, this is another relationship. And also, that conservation requires funding and resources. And when we talk about economics, the economics is the science of making decisions of how to use the scarce resources. So when we have money, when we have people, we can use this money and people to say set up hospitals, set up schools, set up industries, or we can devote certain amount into conservation. Now, conservation requires funds, and this funding will be made available through the use of economics. Because if conservationists do not have a say in the economic decision making, then we will have a situation where we do not have funding for conservation. And in a lot of these, it is necessary to uh, reiterate that the economists and the conservationists are not two categories of people who are fighting against each other. They are working for the same common cause. And that common cause is enhancing the welfare or the surplus of the society. So if you want to have more industries, if you want to have more roads, if you want to have more energy, that is to raise the level of living standards of the people in our society. But a lot of these things can be made available at a much cheaper rate by doing a little bit of conservation. So for instance, if people need to have higher living standards, they will also require clean air and they will require clean water. Now we could go for installing more and more number of air purifiers or water purifiers, or we could just conserve a small bit of forest near where we are living, because the forest will do the same thing. Because climate change is a reality these days, we could go for having more and more number of air conditioners, or we can try to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide, because even if we use more air conditioners, we will be using more energy and we will be emitting even more amount of carbon dioxide. So more air conditioners is not the long term solution. It can work in certain cases in a very short for a very short period of time, but this is not a solution. Now, when conservationists say that let us protect a forest, let us sequester carbon, they are not doing this because they are in love with the forest. They are also doing this because these forests will provide these benefits in the form of ecosystem services to people of our own society. So, this is another relationship between economics and conservation. They have to work hand in glove. The resources can come only when allocated for in the present and in future economic decisions, which is why the economist and the conservationists need to talk to each other. They need to make each other realize what are their strengths and what are the weaknesses. If the economist is looking for the solution of some problem, then it does not do a harm to ask his conservationist friend whether he has a solution. Or if the conservationist is feeling that a certain economic decision is going to be very bad for the environment, and probably his economist friend does not know about it, then it does not do any harm to just sit with the economist and tell the economist that okay, if you do such and such things, there will be such and such repercussions. A lot of solutions come out through dialogue, and which is why it is now very important to understand both economics and conservation and their interrelatedness. We also saw that another relation is that the economic decisions have the power to promote conservation. Power to promote conservation. Things like renewable energy, things like green technology. So when the government says that gas guzzling vehicles will not be permitted, or gas guzzling vehicles will be taxed at a higher rate, or petrol and diesel will be taxed at a higher rate, so that people desist from using more and more of the hydrocarbons and releasing the pollutants, then this is a decision that has both economic ramifications and also ramifications for conservation. Because by doing this, the government is not only saving money that otherwise would have been just burnt into burning of these petroleum products, but the government is also helping in conservation. Now, the thing is that good economic decisions also lead to conservation, and good conservation also leads to better economic outcomes. So, when we have the conservation of a forest, when we have a conservation of a wetland, we should be able to show or highlight that this conservation has led to such and such increase in the welfare of the society. Only then will the society be interested in doing conservation. And so we need to talk on the same terms. So if there is a conservationist who is trying hard to conserve a wetland, then he needs to prove to the society that okay, if you conserve this wetland, you will get better quality water, more pure water, and to have that purity of water, if you if we did not conserve the wetlands, we would have to install a water purification system that would cost so much in the capital investment, and it would cost so much in every year of running expenses. Whereas the conservation of wetland is giving us the same benefits for a much lesser cost. If the conservationist talks in economics terms, then he will be more heard of, he will be more understood by the society and by the decision makers. So, which is why it is very crucial to bring economics and conservation on the same page. Then we had a look at an overview of the course, followed by the decision making. Now, the basic questions of economics like what to produce, how much to produce, for whom to produce, when to produce. Now, these are all the same questions that are asked in every household. When we ask the question that if we have to purchase food, if we have to purchase clothes, whom should we purchase it for? Do children require a new set of clothes in greater necessity as compared to the adults or as compared to our grandparents? So, whenever there is any decision that needs to be made in the household, and remember that economics, the word root has derived from management of household. Whenever any such decision needs to be taken, what do? We sit together. Everybody puts up his or her demands, and the demands that are perceived to be having the greatest necessity are the ones that are passed. So, for instance, if a child is demanding that I need to have an ice cream, and his elder brother is saying that I need to have a new pair of shoes because my old ones are already torn, then probably the parents would decide that no, the ice cream can wait, but the shoes cannot wait. But if the older child is saying that no, I have already four pairs of shoes and I want a fifth pair of shoes, and the younger child is saying that I have not had an ice cream for so many months, I need an ice cream, then probably the parents would go with the younger child. Now, what is happening in these cases is that the family is sitting together, looking at alternatives and making a choice. That is the same choice that needs to be made in the case of conservation as well. We have people who think that forests are very important, conservation is very important, and we have people who say that no, these forests should be cut and converted into a high rise building. Now, when we need to make the decision, we need to keep both these parties on the same table, and the decision makers have to be made aware of the pros and cons of all the decisions. Only then will they be able to make a rational decision. And in this course, we observed that in economics, for a very large portion, we say that people are rational decision makers, which means that they look at alternatives, they explore all the alternatives, they explore what are the pros and cons of everything, they process the information, and after that, they choose that alternative that is the best. So theoretically, even in our households, we choose for that alternative that gives the maximum benefit to everybody in the household. In certain times, there could be discrimination, and certain times there can be aberrations. But for the most part, it's the rational decision making that happens. And the same thing is observed even at the scale of the society. So these basic questions of economics need to be answered, and these questions arise for the fact that we have unlimited wants, but our resources are limited. So there is a conflict. We want more and more of everything. We want more ice creams, we want more shoes, we want more clothes, we want more of everything. But the resources are limited. The money that we have, the time that we have, the effort that we can spend, they are all limited. And when we have unlimited wants and limited resources, we have to make a choice. And these choices bring us to economics, the science of how society manages its scarce resources. And here we saw that there are trade offs everywhere. We need to decide whether to have more schools or more hospitals or more conservation. So, conservation is but one of the things that requires the resources. And so, if we need to devote resources towards conservation, we will have to prove its worth. That yes, such and such amount of money has to be put into conservation because it leads to such and such benefits. And we looked at things such as the production possibility frontier, the efficiency versus equality debate, and cost. So, cost of something is what you give up to get it. And a major cost in economics is the opportunity cost, the next best alternative. That is, if we, for instance, were cutting up the forest to make space for mining, the next best alternative could be to use those forests as they are for, say, things like tourism. Now, when we are giving up the forest to make mine, the opportunity cost of the mine is the money that we would have earned through tourism, the value that we would have earned through this forest in terms of ecosystem benefits, in terms of the benefits that are provided by the biodiversity. And in a number of cases, we make bad choices because we do not consider the opportunity cost in total. So suppose when we are making this decision whether to divert a forest into a mine, if we only take into account the cost of the timber and the cost of the land, then probably we are underselling our forests. But when we do a correct valuation, we will probably figure out that it was much better to have the forest than to convert it into a mine. So, which is why we need to make these correlations between economics and conservations again and again. There are explicit costs, there are implicit costs. Now, implicit costs, because they do not require an outlay of money, it is very easy to forget the implicit costs. And which is what often happens when we are making a choice about conservation. People forget about the implicit costs, especially opportunity costs. Now, economics assumes that people are rational, they are making all the decisions, processing all the information, and a large quantum of the rational thinking happens at the margin. But then we have also observed later on that in the case of behavioral economics, we appreciate the fact that not all the decision making is happening rationally. People at times are irrational too. But for the most part, we assume that people are rational and they are thinking at the margin. And we saw this example that for an airline, even if a passenger is giving less amount of money than the average cost of the ticket, if the amount is sufficient to pay for the excess fuel and the bag of peanuts that the airlines offer, then the airlines should sell this ticket for much lesser. Now, this is an example of marginal thinking. Then we also saw that people respond to incentives. An incentive is something that induces a person to act in a certain manner. And this knowledge that people respond to incentives can be used for the aid of conservation. So, if we want people to desist from doing something, we can put a negative incentive in the form of a higher taxation. If we want to promote something for conservation, we can put in an incentive in the form of a subsidy. So, when the government says that the LED bulbs will be subsidized, or when the government says that gas guzzling vehicles will be taxed more, they are making use of these incentives to induce people to act in a certain manner. Prices act as incentives. And we have observed that the rise in the price of a crude oil can lead to a large change in the thought process of several people. And it can lead to things even as large as political changes. People move towards smaller vehicles, more cost effective vehicles, or more fuel efficient vehicles just because the price of crude oil has increased. So people respond to incentives, and prices are very important incentives. Now, when you have this knowledge, you can use this knowledge. If you do not have this knowledge, you will probably not be using this knowledge. Then we saw that trade can make everyone better off because it permits everybody to specialize into something that they have the highest comparative advantage in. It increases efficiency, so the society gets the largest amount of output from using its scarce resources, reduces prices that benefits the consumers, and it increases the choices that are available. It increases the welfare that people can have. So we saw that trade can make everybody better off. Now, with that learning, we can use it even in the case of conservation. Trade is happening because it is making everybody better off. So we cannot just say that, okay, the uh, vessels that are moving goods from one continent to another, they are emitting pollution. So let us just close the vehicles. Let us just ban these vessels that are moving between the continents. No, we cannot say that. If we know that the vessels are also taking invasive species from one place to another, we cannot just say that, okay, we are not going to permit these. Because trade or the movement of these vessels is also playing a very important social purpose. And we cannot just leave out one thing for another. So we will have to look at alternatives. Once we know that we cannot stop the trade, we will have to look at alternatives. So when we say that zebra mussel is moving from one lake to another lake through ballast water, we cannot say that we are going to ban the ships, but we can at least look at technological solutions that will help prevent the movement of zebra mussels from point A to point B. A very simple solution is that when the ship is moving through the water, so once it has reached into the sea, then the seawater is taken inside of the vessel and the fresh water is poured outside. A solution as simple as this. Because what happens is that the zebra mussel can only live in fresh water, and when it is thrown out into the sea, then it dies in the brackish water. And because you need to ensure that you have ballast water, so the seawater is taken inside. And this is very similar to a rinsing process. So you rinse the whole of the ballast using the seawater. So when you know that trade is serving a social purpose, it cannot be shut out, then only you will start to look for other alternatives for conservation. Then we saw that markets are usually a good way of organizing economic activity. And why is that so? Because it offers several advantages. Prices and self interest are guiding decisions. It is leading to autonomy. It is leading to a freedom of expression. So, nobody is going to tell me what I should wear or not. Nobody should tell me whether I should eat apples or whether I should eat oranges. But I should be having this choice of choosing whether I wish to eat apples or oranges. Now, in the case of a command economy, the government decides what will be made available to which people at what prices. But in the case of a market economy, there is an expression of the free will. The thing that people want more, its demand would go up. When the demand goes up, the price would go up. When the price goes up, it acts as an incentive. More and more sellers or more and more producers get into the market. There is an automatic flow of information. Information flows very quickly from the buyers to the sellers. So, for instance, in a command economy, the government would have to go for a survey of what people want. And with the results of that survey, the government would have decided what to produce, how much to produce. But with the market, this information passes automatically. Then we have the invisible hand that leads the firms and the consumers to the desirable outcomes. And this is happening very fast. And so the welfare or the surplus of the society, it reaches to the optimum level. We have observed in one of the lectures that the highest surplus in the society occurs at the market equilibrium, where the demand and the supply curves meet each other. So this is another important learning of economics. This is one of the principles of economics. Then we also observed that governments can sometimes improve the market outcomes. So we are not saying that markets are the final solutions for everything, because in a number of cases the markets can do bring the society to a suboptimal level, especially because the markets do not consider externalities. And so the government needs to step in certain cases. So when the government steps in, it can put things such as taxes, it can make use of subsidies, it can make use of price controls, it can make use of just banning things altogether, so that the society reaches a more optimum level of output. So the governments can improve the market outcomes, and the governments are also needed to enforce rules, maintain institutions, enforce the property rights, so that the markets are able to function. Then we looked at market failures, things such as externalities and market power. Market power is the ability of a single economic actor or a small group of actors to have a substantial influence on the market prices. And we looked at how monopolies have a tremendous amount of market power. Because in the case of monopolies, they are not price takers, they are price makers. They can sell at any rate that they want. And when they choose the rate at which their profits are maximum, in a number of cases, a large number of people in the society, they just do not have access to the goods. So this is another example of market failure. So the governments need to step in certain cases. The government needs to step in to promote equality because the market may not do that. Then another principle of economics is that the country's standard of living depends on its productivity. The more goods and services the country produces, the more goods and services are available for use of its citizens. And this productivity or having more and more production is what is also leading to a large number of environmental disasters. Because we have observed in one of the lectures that the amount of plastics that we are producing, it is going up exponentially. Now, we need to pause for a while and we need to think whether such large of production of plastics is good for us or whether it is bad for us, which is again where economics and conservation needs to talk to each other. Then we saw that prices rise when the government prints a lot of money, and in the short run, there is a correlation between the inflation rate and unemployment rate. So if the government goes for a large amount of inflation, then there will be less amount of unemployment. If the inflation is low, then the unemployment will be high. So this is a correlation. So when we say that economics is the science of making decisions, this is a relation that needs to be kept in mind. That you cannot have both best of both of the things. You cannot have low inflation and low unemployment. You have to choose between one of these, and this is what leads to business cycles. Then in the second module we looked at what is conservation, and we began with conservation in the Anthropocene. And Anthropocene is a proposed epoch or a proposed time dating from the commencement of significant human impact on Earth's geology and ecosystems, including but not limited to anthropogenic climate change. So this is Anthropocene. That is the age of human beings, where the human beings are having a tremendous impact on the Earth, its geology, its ecosystems, and so on. And what are the kinds of impacts that we are having? We are having things like overconsumption of resources. We are witnessing things like habitat destruction, desertification, acidification of oceans, depletion of ozone, changes in biogeochemical cycles, all these different impacts on the environment. So even though it is the age of the humans, a large number of these impacts are negative impacts, which are even negatively influencing the human beings themselves. Because when there is desertification, then a large number of farmers are unable to raise their crops. The productivity goes down. And we saw that the productivity determines what will be the standard of living. So, in the race to have more and more productivity, what we did was to have more and more production. And a large portion of this production was done using fossil fuels. Because of excessive use of fossil fuels, we were emitting a large amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which led to global warming, climate change, and desertification. Now, once you reach a stage of desertification, the productivity goes down. Now, once you have a low productivity, then you have a low standard of living. So, even though we were trying to raise the standard of living, ultimately we reached a point where the standard of living is even worse. So we need to look at these interactions. We just cannot make use of classical economics and say that, okay, we need to increase production, do it by whatsoever means possible. So these are the human impacts. And we take the explosion of the atomic weapon as the beginning of the Anthropocene. And these days, there are large talks about the quantum of the human impacts. And we looked at this formula I is equal to P into A into T. That is, the impact of humans in an area is governed by three things. The population in the area. More the number of people, more is the impact on the environment. The affluence or the amount of resources that each person uses. And the technology. And we observed that in the beginning, when these were less, we had lesser impacts, and as these grew, we had more impacts. So world population has been increasing, it has been increasing exponentially, the densities are increasing, the GDP is increasing, which is telling us that the affluence also is increasing. So in the formula, I is equal to P into A into T, P is increasing, A is increasing, T is also increasing, the technological progress. And when all these three are increasing, then we have a stage when we are putting a lot of impact on the environment, which is why we need to stop and think. Because earlier, if we look at our societies, earlier the population was low, affluence was low, technology was low, and that was the period when we could have used as much resources as we wanted. Because our requirements were low, and at the same time, we did not have the technologies to overexploit the resources. So even if we wanted to overexploit, we could not have overexploited. But then, when the population increased, the affluence increased, the technology increased, we still, for a time being, we had an option to expand our empires. So if we have destroyed our forest, we will go to the neighbor's forest and we'll destroy that as well to get more and more resources. But then these days we have mostly used up all the resources that we could have ever used. And so now we no longer have an excess of resources that we can exploit. So we looked at the development of conservation in the first stage, the impact was low, hardly any need to conserve. Then with modernization, more and more resources get scarce. People start talking about conservation, but they could expand their empires. But now there is no more place left to expand the empire. Now, these days, because of these impacts, we are now emphasizing on things like recycling, reduction of usage of things. So earlier we were saying that we should produce more, we should consume more, and that would lead to a higher standard of living. These days we are emphasizing reduce, reuse, recycle, so that our impact is lessened. Then we saw that we have already reached the peak of our population growth, which brings us to the next topic, the human population growth. And here we looked at the Malthusian model. Now, Malthus predicted that population or the human population grows in geometric progression. That is, from 1 it becomes 2, then becomes 4, then 8, then 16. So at every stage it is getting multiplied by 2. But he said that the agricultural production or the resources will not increase at this faster pace. They will increase in arithmetic progression, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and so on. And so in a short period of time, we are going to have a scarcity of resources. Now, when there is a scarcity of resources, there are two options available. One, we should bring our population down ourselves by things such as population control, or by things such as late marriages or celibacy. Or the other option is that nature will bring the population down by itself by making use of things such as floods or diseases or pestilence. Now, the choice is with the people. So, he said that there are two kinds of checks. There are positive checks, which essentially are negative checks because they are all negative qualities such as vice, misery, famine, war, disease, floods, and so on. But the other option is the preventive checks, foresight, late marriage, celibacy, moral restraint, and so on. So, this is in crux the Malthusian growth model. And the world population has been increasing. We looked at doubling times. But the thing is that Malthus could not have predicted way back that we will also be having an increase in the technologies. So we have been able to uh, postpone the situation of crisis by having better technologies. So we have been using more fertilizers, we have developed pesticides, we have developed high yielding varieties of crops. And all of this has helped us to avoid the crisis situation. So, still today, we are able to meet the requirements of human beings. But that does not mean that we will forever be able to meet the requirements because there is a limit to everything. But so far, what we have observed is that the doubling time is not what Malthus has predicted, it has been changing. The agricultural growth has been changing. We have observed exponential increase in yields, and we have increased the land usage, we have increased different areas, and we have increased the technology. So because of all of these, we have been able to bypass or postpone the position of crisis. And we also observed that in population ecology, we have these standard equations of population growth. So what Malthus had predicted was this exponential rise in population, but what we normally observe is a logistic growth. Now, logistic growth means that in the beginning, when the resources are plenty, any population grows up exponentially. So there is a small lag because the initial population itself is less. So this is the lag phase. But then once you have sufficient number of individuals, the population starts to grow up exponentially. Now, with this exponential growth, what happens is that after a while, the resources now start to become less and less. They have become scarcer, because of which the population growth rate again starts to decrease, and we start to see a stabilization. So here the growth rate was less, here again it is less. The population is more or less stabilized, but in between there is an exponential growth. And in certain cases, there is also a collapse in the population, especially if the population has become too old or when the population density is so high that there is a single disease and everybody gets wiped off. So this is what we have been observing in a large number of organisms. And we have the problems of statics and dynamics. We also looked at unsustainable development. Now, unsustainable development is the opposite of sustainable development, which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, sustainable development asks this question that okay, we need the resources, but how much of the resources should we be using today, and how much of the resources should be left for the future generations? Because if we use up everything today, then not much will be left for the future generations, and they will be in a perilous situation. That is, if you have, say, a lake, and this lake has different fishes, and you are doing fishing. So there are two options available. Option one is that if you are grading, you take out all fish. And once you have taken out all the fish, there is no more fish that is left in the lake. And so next year or for your next generation, there is nothing left. They will not have any fish. The other option is that you can take it out sustainably. Now, when we are taking out fish sustainably, it means that we will not take out 100% of the fishes. We will probably say take out 20% or 30% of the fishes. And the fishes that remain in the lake will procreate, will give rise to more number of fishes, so that next year also we will take out 30%. Then next year also we will take out 30%. So if you represented that in the form of a curve, what we are observing is that with time, the first option was that we take out all the fishes and then the population crashes. We do not have any more fishes. Let us say that this is the number of fish. The other option is that we take out some fishes, then we give it certain time so that the fish population again rises back. Then we take out some fishes, then we again give it time, then we again take it out, then we again give it time, and so in this manner we can take out these fishes for a very long period of time, perhaps till infinity. So we are leaving enough fishes so that our next generation, that is our children or our grandchildren, are also able to uh, use these fishes. So that is sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present. Now, in this case, we are not saying that we will leave all the fishes for our future generations. No, we are meeting our own needs as well. But we are meeting these needs without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. That is sustainable development. And when we talk about sustainable development, we need to talk about needs. Now, there is a difference between need and want. We can have a very large amount of wants. So I may want to have one car, then second car, then a third car. Probably I will want to have 50 cars. But I do not need 50 cars. I'll probably only need one car. Or probably my family of four will require one car. So there is a difference between needs and wants. Needs refers to the essential things that are required. Wants are unlimited, but needs are never unlimited. And when we talk about sustainable development, there is an idea of limitations because there is a choice. We cannot meet all the wants of the present generation and also leave enough for the next generations. So we need to choose, and this choice is sustainable development. Now, in this context, we looked at three pillars of sustainability: environmental sustainability, economic, and social sustainability. And we looked at different components of these: ecosystem services, air quality. When we talk about social sustainability, we are talking about justice, we are talking about empowerment, we are talking about education, we are talking about access to resources. So these all things are social sustainability. And we also look at economic sustainability. That is things like job security, incentives, market practices. natural resource accounting, life cycle cost assessment. Now, all of these help us make economic decisions in such a manner that they are sustainable choices. Very good example is plastics. Plastics are cheap to produce because of which we have been producing large amounts. But then they are cheap to produce when you do not take into account the life cycle cost, because the plastics are very expensive when it comes to collecting them, treating them, disposing them. And so, if you do not take into account the life cycle cost, you will say that plastics are very cheap. But if you take into account the life cycle cost assessment from the cradle to the grave, then you'll figure out that no, plastics, they require a very great amount of investment. And probably we would have been much better if we were not using the plastics. So this is economic sustainability. And we also talked about the triple bottom line where all these three things are incorporated. Then there is weak and strong sustainability. Weak sustainability says that, okay, if we are not preserving our natural resources, but if we are having more industries or we are having more roads, then that is fine. But strong sustainability says that no, we need more industries, we need more roads, but we also need forests. And so we cannot give up the forest to have more roads. So that is the basic difference. So this is one school of thought, that is the weak and strong sustainability. Then we looked at sustainable development goals and things like clean technology, renewable energy, water purification, air purification. And when we talk about clean technology for sustainability, in a number of cases, we come to the realization that well functioning ecosystems provide us with a lot of these outcomes. So, if you want to have water purification, you can install a water purification plant and put money into running it, or you can say conserve a wetland, or you can conserve a forest, so that the water that is coming to you is pure from the beginning. There are no contaminants, so you do not have to purify it. So we looked at several clean technologies, and then in the third module, we looked at the modern impacts that are necessitating conservation, or the impacts that are making conservation an urgency these days. Things like climate change, plastics, oil spills, and mining. And here we began with climate change. So, climate is a broad composite of the average conditions of a region, measured in terms of things like temperature, rainfall, snowfall, snow and ice covered winds. And generally, we take these averages for 30 years. So, that is climate. Now, when we say that it is a broad composite over a long period of time, it means that when we talk about climate change, there is a long term change that is happening. So we looked at different components of climate. So there are these five components: the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the cryosphere, the biosphere, and the atmosphere. These components interact with each other, and when they interact, and if there is a forcing, then that would lead to certain responses. And if these responses are statistically significant, then we will say that there is a climate change. A statistically significant variation in either the mean state of the climate or its variability that is persisting for an extended period, typically decades or longer. That is, climate change occurs over an extended period of time. We will not say changes over the course of a few days, a few weeks, or a few months as climate change. But the climate change will be continued over a long period, say decades. Now, in this context, we looked at different forcings. Forcings could include things like changes in plate tectonics, changes in Earth's orbit, changes in the sun's strength, or anthropogenic forcing, which is the man made forcing. And these days, this is the most important forcing. And because of these forcings, we can have changes in any of the five components. And this may show itself in the form of heat waves, or extreme climates, or droughts, or floods, or forest fires, and so on. Now, we looked at different biological responses, phenological anomalies. So, essentially, the climate change is impacting the ecosystems in very big ways. We are finding that several organisms are being pushed towards the threat of extinction. The corals are bleaching out, the uh, kelps are dying out, and we are observing these large scale habitat level destructions that will have impacts on several organisms. There is a rise in invasion and that of exotic species. So we looked at all these different factors. This is important: local extinctions due to climate change. So when the climate changes, there is a warm edge that gets developed, which is typically the region that is closer to the equator or towards the equator. So when the temperature increases, then the organisms in this warm edge, they find that the conditions are no longer congenial. They die out. On the other hand, certain other areas that were earlier too cold for the organisms to survive, they have now become more congenial. And so there is a cold range expansion and a warm edge local extinction. And this uh, change in the uh, cold edge extension is being observed primarily in the case of insects because they are now reaching higher up in the mountains. We are also observing changes in the allele frequencies in things such as the tawny oil. And to solve the problem of climate change, we have got two options: mitigation and adaptation. Now, mitigation is the set of those techniques that we use that bring down the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So when we say climate change mitigation, we are trying to avoid climate change. And when we say climate change adaptation, we are trying to live with the climate change. So mitigation would involve things like those options that reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is being emitted. So if we shift from incandescent bulbs to LED bulbs so that we consume lesser electricity and so we reduce the amount of carbon emissions, that is mitigation. If we shift from thermal power plants to solar power plants, that is climate change mitigation. Or we can use things that bring down the level of carbon dioxide that has already been emitted. So things like afforestation, when we are growing more plants, which will absorb this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that is mitigation. But when we talk about adaptation, we are trying to live with the climate change. So installation of air conditioners is an adaptation that we can make. So we have these two options, and often both of these options work together. So mitigation options are those that reduce emission or those that create sinks. And there are three different kinds of adaptations: anticipatory versus reactive, or autonomous versus planned, and private versus public. And there is an adaptive capacity, which is the ability of a system to adjust. And if we cross the adaptive capacity, then in that case, we will not be able to perform the adaptation. We also have a thing called as maladaptation, which is bad adaptation. So if we do something that inadvertently increases the vulnerability, an adaptation that does not succeed in reducing vulnerability, but increases it instead, is a maladaptation. Now, in the case of adaptation, we have got these three options: create resistance to change, resilience to change, or response to change. So resistance to change means that you create such conditions that the systems are able to resist the impacts of the climate change. Resilience means that even if the system succumbs to the climate change, but you have options that if later on in the future the conditions become back to normal, then these systems should be able to come back to the original state. And the third is response to change. That is, we are trying to facilitate movement. So assisted migration to newer areas, managing for asynchrony, that is a response to the change. Then in the next lecture, we explored plastics. And plastics are synthetic materials made from wide range of organic polymers that can be molded into a shape when they are soft and then set into a rigid or a slightly elastic form. And plastics are everywhere because of their important properties. They are lightweight, they are cheap to produce, they are strong, they are water resistant, and there are several of these good properties because of which plastics have become a mainstay in our lives. And if you look at the production of plastics, it has been growing practically exponentially at the rate of 5% per annum, and a very small portion is being recovered, which is reused or recycled. And when you have a a very small portion that is getting recovered, what happens to the rest? The rest are treated in different ways. They are burnt, which releases dioxin and carbon dioxide. Otherwise, they are put into landfills, and we are already running short of space, or they get released into the environment, such as the floating plastics or the plastics that wash to the shore or the plastics that sink to the bottom of the seafloor. And we have this size classification. So you have large plastic, medium sized plastic, or small plastics. And typically, when the plastics degrade, then there is some amount of degradation that happens because of the impact of light and the impact of oxygen. And because of that, and because of mechanical degradation, the plastics reduce in size. And so we have these three categories: macro, meso, and micro degree. And we observe that the plastics have a large number of negative impacts on wildlife. Animals confuse them for food, and in that case, the animals die. And we are observing these in several organisms. They can lead to entanglement, especially things such as these ghost nets. So the animals get entangled and they die. Or we have things such as these chemical disruptors, persistent bioaccumulative toxic substances, accumulation and concentration of hydrophobic toxins. So on their surface, the hydrophobic toxins, they get accumulated to a very high concentration. Potential to alter habitat and behavior. So we are observing that organisms are now living with these plastics. They are showing a behavior that is not a natural behavior. And we are seeing this even inside of the tiger reserves. And they are aiding in the dispersal of invasive species. So there are options that we have. We can recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle, lifestyle changes, or alternative materials that are biodegradable plastics. So that is in short what is about plastics. Then we looked at oil spills and mining, and we looked at the impacts of large infrequent disturbances. Now, if there is a healthy community and if there is a large infrequent disturbance, the community will lower in its state. Quite a number of organisms will die out, but then there is also the natural process of recovery. So the community will be able to come back to the normal. But if the community suffers from multiple disturbances, or when the community state itself is not a normal state, in that case, we can have a condition in which the community will be altered permanently. And one example of this large infrequent disturbance is the oil spill, in which the liquid petroleum gets released into the environment. It can be released in the terrestrial domain, it can be released in the marine domain, that is in the aquatic areas. It can be due to a natural cause, an accidental cause, an intentional cause, and when that happens, the hydrocarbons get released. So these are some prominent hydrocarbons. And we classify hydrocarbons on the basis of specific gravity, on the basis of their origin, whether they are originated from rocks, they are originated from the impact of fire, or they are originated from the impact of biological organisms. And then we looked at the impact of oil. So some portion will float to the surface, some portion will come down in the form of sedimentation, some portion will get dissolved, some portion will be dispersed, some portion will be emulsified. And when that happens, quite a large number of organisms get exposed to them. The oil spreads on the surface, it gets evaporated, it gets degraded because of photooxidation, and in the biological domain, there can be bioaccumulation or biodegradation. And in this case, we looked at the impacts upon coating, the impacts of dissolved things, factors influencing the impact. So if there are organisms that get impacted in a crucial period of their life cycle, then the impact is much greater. Things such as young ones or eggs, they are much easily impacted. Then health and condition, vulnerability, sensitivity. And so there are several impacts that we have of these oil spills. And in this case, we looked at the ways of reducing the impact. So we can go with cleaning. And in the case of cleaning, we try to return the system to a level of petrochemicals that has no detectable impact on the function of the ecosystem. So that is cleaning. Or we could go with a recovery, which is a re-establishment of a biological community. So cleanup operations, you can contain the oil by using floating objects, or you can scoop up the oil, or you can burn the oil, or you can disperse the oil using detergents, or you can let nature act, or you can aid the action of nature by, say, putting certain fertilizers or certain nutrients so that those microorganisms that can degrade the oil, they increase in their numbers. And similar to the oil spill, another large infrequent disturbance is mining, which leads to things like deforestation or soil erosion, creation of sinkholes, water pollution, such as in the case of a tailings dam, loss of habitats. And we looked at this Oak Tady mine, in which there is a large change in the ecosystem. And here we talked about the strategies to protect the ecosystems. Now, in one of the lectures, we have seen that the ecosystems provide us with several benefits, the ecosystem services. And so when the ecosystems get damaged, then there is a loss of a natural resource. And so we need to protect the resource so that we can maximize the surplus to the society. And in that case, there are several strategies. We can avoid setting up rigs and mines in vulnerable spots, prevent things, develop models, develop technologies, or improve the degraded habitats. In which case, we talked about things like reclamation, restoration, replacement, and enhancement. So these are different options that are available with us. And in this context, the environment impact assessment has also become very crucial. And in the case of environment impact assessment, we look at the kinds of impacts that will be seen when an activity is taken up. So that's all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.